There's a funny thing about life, you know? It's like a river. You can build all the dams you want, try to control its flow, divert it here, hoard it there. You can even convince yourself you own the whole damn river. But eventually, the water finds its own way, often washing away everything you thought you de-built on its banks. And sometimes, when all that artificial stuff is gone, when the river takes back what it always owned, that's when you finally see the true, clear current for the first time. That's when you realize the real riches were never in the dams or the diversions, but in the steady, honest flow itself. Glenn, he knew a thing or two about currents, about things being washed away. 42 years old, and he'd seen more than his fair share of high water and empty riverbeds. You'd find him most days down at the plant, the old Monarch Metals factory, the one that's been coughing and sputtering out parts for car engines and HVAC units since before his granddad was a sprout. He wasn't running the place, not anymore. He was on the floor, same as the other 100 men and women who clocked in before the sun even thought about making an appearance. He was a man who looked like he belonged there, amongst the clang and hum of heavy machinery. Built solid, Glenn was, like a seasoned oak tree that's weathered its share of storms. Not a mountain of a man, but you could tell by the way his shoulders sat, broad and slightly stooped, that he carried weight. Not just the weight of the steel he handled, but the invisible kind too, the kind that settles deep in a man's bones. His hands, though, those were the real storytellers. Knuckles thickened, calluses like old leather, scars running faint paths over his skin. They were a testament to a life earned by the sweat of his brow. They were the hands of a man who worked, really worked for what he had. His face was a roadmap of quiet resolve. Lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, etched there by countless sunrises seen through smudged factory windows, and maybe a few too many worries tucked away in the deep recesses of his mind. His eyes themselves were a deep, tired blue, the kind that had seen a lot but didn't give much away. They were observant, though. You'd catch him watching, taking things in, processing it all behind that still unexpressive face. Glenn wasn't one for small talk. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did offer a word, it was usually worth hearing. When he shook your hand, it wasn't some flimsy politician's grip. It was firm, warm, and honest, a quiet promise of dependability. There was an uncomplaining air about him, a man who just got on with it, whatever it happened to be that day. He moved with the measured pace of someone who understood the rhythm of hard work, knew how to conserve his energy, how to last. There was a resilience in his every step, a quiet strength that made you instinctively trust him. He was Glenn, a factory man, a steady hand in a world that often felt anything but. His world began before the sun. 5 a.m., a digital bark slicing through the dark, cold air in his modest bedroom. A soft kiss for Sarah, his wife, then quick coffee. Gravel crunched under his boots to the beat-up pickup. The factory floor swallowed him for 8, often 10 hours. Grinding metal, whirring machines, an endless loop. Feeding material, checking gauges, stacking. Honest, steady work, but a treadmill. His body knew the rhythm. His mind, however, ceaselessly calculated. The mortgage on their small house, bills for Emily 14 and David 11, groceries, gas. A tightrope walk between paychecks and expenses, a low hum of financial anxiety that never quite broke. The factory floor swallowed him for 8, often 10 hours. Grinding metal, whirring machines, an endless loop. Feeding material, checking gauges, stacking. Honest, steady work, but a treadmill. His body knew the rhythm. His mind, however, ceaselessly calculated. The mortgage on their small house, bills for Emily 14 and David 11, groceries, gas. A tightrope walk between paychecks and expenses, a low hum of financial anxiety that never quite broke. It was the constant thrum of the machines, a vibration that settled deep in his bones, mirroring the ceaseless worry that buzzed behind his eyes. Another pallet of gleaming steel sheets, another careful lift, the rhythmic clank as it settled into place. He worked without complaint, his movements precise, practiced over years. But the ache in his shoulders at the end of a shift wasn't just from the physical labor. It was from the invisible weight of responsibility, the quiet burden of knowing every dollar had to stretch just a little further. He'd catch himself staring at a machine, the gears meshing in perfect, relentless order, and wonder if his own life was just another cog in an uncaring system. Lunch breaks were brief, usually eaten alone or with a nod to a fellow worker, his gaze distant. He'd watch the others talk about weekend plans, kids, soccer games, a new fishing reel. He'd nod, maybe offer a quiet grunt of agreement, but his mind would drift. He wasn't thinking about the next shift. He was thinking about the old pickup's strange new rattle, or the price of Emily's school trip, or the quiet way Sarah had asked about cutting back on a few things. Every expense felt like a personal failure, a reminder that the world wasn't as forgiving as he once thought. And that was the real phantom limb Glenn carried. Not a missing arm, but a missing life. There were moments, fleeting and unwelcome, when the smell of factory oil would be momentarily replaced by the faint memory of expensive leather in a sleek car, or the clatter of machinery would become the distant hum of a private jet. He'd see a young kid on his phone, oblivious, entitled, and a flash of his own younger self would hit him like a punch to the gut. The arrogance, the casual dismissal of anyone who hadn't been born into a position. It was a ghost he wrestled with every day. He remembered the ease, the utter lack of worry. Success, he'd been told, was an inheritance, a birthright. He'd treated it like a given, a wellspring that would never run dry. Relationships. Superficial, based on what he could provide or what people expected from his status. He thought he was a big shot, a player, when in reality he was just a kid playing with someone else's money. The man he was then, entitled, dismissive, blind to the real effort it took to build anything lasting, was a shameful shadow that sometimes flickered at the edge of his vision. It whispered doubts, questioned his worth, reminded him of how far he'd fallen. He yearned for a stability that felt earned, not just handed over. There was a quiet strength in him now, forged in the heat of this new, hard reality, but beneath it throbbed a lingering sense of inadequacy. He was always trying to prove something, not to others, but to himself. That he wasn't the failure the market crash had made him out to be. That he wasn't still the naive, spoiled kid who took everything for granted. He would never ask for help, not really, not if he could avoid it. His pride, a stubborn holdover from a lifetime ago, still kept a tight grip, even as his current life screamed for a break, a little slack. He sometimes found himself staring at his calloused hands, hands that once barely knew the meaning of honest toil, and a wave of regret would wash over him, heavy and cold. All those years, all that opportunity squandered. He was building something now, brick by painstaking brick, but sometimes the weight of the past made each brick feel like a mountain. The weight of that past became a mountain the day Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer, cleared his throat in the stuffy, wood-paneled office. The air itself felt heavy, thick with unspoken dread. Glenn sat across a polished mahogany table, his father's face etched with a fear Glenn had never seen before, his mother's hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Uncle Arthur, ever the smooth operator, sat awkwardly to the side, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous twitch in his eye. The market had been a wild beast for months, but the family's manufacturing business, Glenn's birthright, was supposed to be bulletproof. An empire built over 3 generations, solid as granite. Then Mr. Henderson started talking. Words like insolvency, restructuring, liquidation began to fall like stones, each one chipping away at the foundation Glenn had always taken for granted. He remembered the precise moment the world tilted. Henderson paused, adjusted his spectacles, and delivered the killing blow, his voice devoid of emotion, a professional delivering bad news. The board has voted. The company will declare bankruptcy at close of business today. Due to severe mismanagement of assets by Mr. Arthur Thompson, a quick, accusatory glance at the uncle who suddenly seemed to shrink, and the unprecedented downturn in the market, there is nothing left. The family trust funds, the various investments, they are irrevocably tied to the company's solvency. As of today, gentlemen, you are looking at zero. Zero, the word hung in the air, a flat, final note that echoed in Glenn's ears. It wasn't just the company. It wasn't just the inheritance he'd casually assumed would always be there. It was everything. Every safety net, every fallback, every comfort. Gone, wiped clean. He remembered his mother's soft gasp, his father's slow, deliberate nod as if accepting a death sentence. There was no anger, no shouting, just a profound, silent devastation. Glenn felt a strange detachment, watching his own life unravel like a cheap sweater, thread by thread. All he was left with were the clothes on his back, a few personal effects, and the crushing weight of his parents' shattered expectations, a mountain far steeper than any he'd ever imagined. That night's sleep was a cruel joke. He found himself pacing through the cavernous, suddenly hollow house he'd grown up in. The expensive art on the walls, the imported rugs underfoot, the antique furniture, they were just props in a play that had abruptly ended. At 3:17 a.m., the glowing numbers on the clock radio seemed to mock him, a stark reminder of the long, dark hours ahead. He slumped onto the cold kitchen tiles, the last vestiges of entitlement stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed. What had his life become? More importantly, what had it been? He'd lived in a gilded cage, believing the shine came from him, not the gold bars surrounding him. He saw the entitled, dismissive kid he used to be, the one who'd scoffed at people punching time clocks, who'd believed hard work was for suckers, not for those destined for greatness. He'd never learned to build, only to inhabit what was already built. He'd never learned to earn, only to spend. The brutal honesty of the moment hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just broke, he was broken. An empty suit, a paper tiger, a man whose only identity had been tied to a name and a fortune that no longer existed. He felt like a fraud, a sham. The shame burned in his gut, a fire stoked by regret and a chilling fear of the unknown. He had no skills, no plan, no idea how to provide for anyone, let alone himself, in a world that no longer cared about his last name. He just lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, the silence of the house amplifying the deafening roar of his own failure. It had been 3 weeks since the world Glenn knew had simply evaporated. Not with a bang, but with a series of clipped, desperate phone calls and a final, humiliating meeting in a sterile law office. His uncle, Robert, the man who'd inherited the helm of the family's manufacturing empire, sat across the polished mahogany table, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and broken promises. The market crash had been the final, brutal wave, but the ship had been taking on water for years, thanks to Robert's reckless expansions and a talent for making bad bets look like bold moves. Glenn, who'd sat in on a few board meetings over the years, more as an observer than a participant, remembered the mounting reports of mismanagement, the growing debts, the nervous coughs from the company's CFO. He'd brushed it off then, confident in the family name, in the sheer immensity of their accumulated wealth. But immensity, it turned out, was no match for greed and global economics. The words from the lawyer, precise and clinical, sliced through the air. Chapter 11. Insurmountable debt. All assets liquidated. No remaining funds for shareholders or trust beneficiaries. Not just the company, but the family trust funds, the bedrock of their perpetual comfort, were gone. Wiped clean, just like that. The inheritance Glenn had always taken for granted, the unspoken guarantee of a life of ease, vanished into thin air, leaving him with nothing but a few personal belongings and a sudden, terrifying emptiness. Remembered the ride home, the oppressive silence in the backseat of the hired car, and then the look in his parents' eyes. Not anger, not even outright sorrow, but a deep, profound disappointment that settled over him like a shroud. They hadn't yelled, hadn't cried. They had simply stared, their gazes heavy with the weight of generations of expectation, of a legacy squandered, of a future he was supposed to secure, now undone. He saw the questions in their unspoken words. What now, Glenn? What will you do? As if he had a magic wand to conjure back what was lost. The man who'd never worked a day for his own dollar was now expected to pull a rabbit out of an empty hat. Back on the cold kitchen tiles, the ghost of that disappointment was a physical ache in his chest. His heart hammered not from exertion, but from the sheer, suffocating panic that had settled in his bones. The silence of the house had once been a comfort, a symbol of his privacy and space. Now it was a tomb, echoing with the sound of his own uselessness. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could rewind time not to save the money, but to save himself from becoming this hollowed-out version of the man he was supposed to be. He pictured the sneer on his face when he'd once driven past a factory at closing time, thinking, poor bastards trading their lives for a paycheck. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. Now that was him. Or rather, that was what he needed to be, but he didn't even know how. The fear wasn't just for himself. It was for the future he hadn't built, hadn't even considered, for a wife and children he didn't yet have but would someday. How could he provide for them? What could he offer? He saw himself, a future phantom, begging for scraps, clinging to a faded name that meant nothing to the world outside his collapsed bubble. His past arrogance, his casual dismissal of others' struggles, returned to him with chilling clarity, each memory a fresh stab of guilt. He wasn't just broke. He was fundamentally unprepared, a prince stripped of his kingdom, left naked and vulnerable in a world he'd always believed he was above. The truth of his inadequacy, of his complete lack of practical skill or earned experience, was a crushing weight. He just lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, the silence of the house amplifying the deafening roar of his own failure. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, the darkness pressing in, the weight of his own uselessness suffocating. The roar of failure slowly began to fade, replaced by a dull ache, a profound exhaustion that seeped into his bones. It wasn't just physical fatigue from sleepless nights. It was a weariness of the soul, a profound depletion of the spirit. He'd hit bottom, and the surprising thing was there was no dramatic crash, just this quiet, desolate settling. Then somewhere in that deep, empty space, a different kind of sound began to form. Not a roar, but a whisper. A single, clear thought that cut through the haze of self-pity and regret. Enough. Not enough of this life, or enough of this pain, but simply, profoundly enough. Enough of lying here. Enough of drowning in what was. Enough of the phantom ache of what might have been. There was no grand epiphany, no sudden surge of inspiration. Just the quiet, stark recognition that the current path was unsustainable, that the inertia of despair was more terrifying than any future he might build with his own two hands. He didn't know what was next or how he would find it. He only knew he couldn't stay here, not one more minute. The first rays of dawn, a pale gray smear against the window, found him still awake, but changed. The decision wasn't a sudden light switch. It was a slow, agonizing crawl out of the mire. He swung his legs out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath his bare feet, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the crushing need to simply pull the covers back over his head. The next few days were a blur of humiliation and cold, hard reality. His resume, once a testament to inherited privilege and a few token summer internships in management, was now a flimsy joke. There were no connections left to pull, no old favors to call in. The phone didn't ring with offers, it didn't ring at all. Glenn, a man who had grown up believing his name was currency, found it was now nothing more than a ghost of a forgotten empire. He swallowed his pride, a bitter, lumpy pill, and started walking into places he'd once driven past with a dismissive glance. Construction sites, warehouses, factories. He offered to do anything. Clean, sweep, lift, haul. Most places gave him a polite no, or an outright laugh. He looked too soft, too clean, too much like someone who had never truly worked a day in his life. And they were right. The truth stung, a constant, low-grade throb beneath his skin. He was a fraud pretending to be a working man. Finally, after nearly a week of rejection, a small manufacturing plant 2 towns over gave him a chance. A graveyard shift, entry-level, packing boxes of machine parts onto pallets. The pay was barely above minimum wage, enough to cover utilities and food, maybe, if he was careful. It was less than he used to spend on a single bottle of wine. But it was something. It was an opportunity to truly earn, the first dollar of his new life. His first shift started at 11 p.m. The factory floor was a cacophony of banging metal, whirring machinery, and the distant hiss of hydraulics. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. His uniform, a stiff, oversized pair of coveralls, felt alien on his skin. A grizzled supervisor, a man with hands like knotty oak and eyes that had seen 1,000 shifts, gave him a cursory tour and pointed to a stack of boxes. "See those? Get 'em on these pallets. By morning, those pallets better be full, wrapped, and ready for loading. Any questions?" Glenn shook his head, his voice caught somewhere in his throat. He watched the other men, their movements fluid, efficient, their faces etched with a familiar weariness he was only just beginning to understand. His own hands, once accustomed only to gripping a golf club or a cocktail glass, felt clumsy and soft. He picked up the first box. It was heavier than it looked, filled with dense, oiled steel components. He stacked it, then another, then another. Sweat pricked his brow within minutes. His back began to ache. His shoulders burned. Every muscle protested, screaming in unison against the sudden, brutal demands being made of them. He thought about quitting before the first hour was even up. The urge was so strong, so overwhelming, a primal desire to flee this harsh, unforgiving environment and retreat back into the comfortable darkness of his shame. He pictured his old life, the plush office, the easy money, the dismissive wave of his hand at men like these. A fresh wave of nausea washed over him. He felt ridiculous, pathetic, a tourist in a world he had no business being in. But then in the suffocating heat and grinding noise, another image formed. The phantom faces of his future wife and children, their eyes looking at him, not with judgment, but with a quiet, expectant hope. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing it because he had to. He was doing it because this was how he would build, brick by painful brick, the foundation he had once taken for granted. He picked up another box. His movements were slow, awkward, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Day 3 dawned like a punch to the gut. Every muscle Glenn possessed screamed in protest, a symphony of aches he hadn't known possible. His shoulders felt like they'd been stretched on a medieval rack, his back a solid, unyielding plank of pain. Getting out of bed was an act of raw willpower, each movement a deliberate, agonizing choice. Sarah, bless her heart, left a thermos of coffee and a couple of ibuprofen on the counter, her quiet concern a heavy blanket. He swallowed the pills dry, the bitterness mirroring the taste in his mouth. He was slower on the line that day, his motions stiff and reluctant. The rhythm of the factory, which had seemed just alien on day one, now felt mocking, a relentless march that left him perpetually a step behind. The seasoned workers around him moved with an almost balletic grace born of years, their hands flying, their bodies knowing exactly where to be. He was a stone in a fast-flowing river, a clumsy, inefficient impediment. Shame curled in his gut, hot and persistent. He kept his eyes down, avoided glances, just focused on the next component, the next box, the next minute. The ghost of his past self, lounging in an expensive suit, sipping scotch, seemed to hover just out of sight, whispering about how far he'd fallen, how utterly unsuited he was for this brutal, honest labor. He wished for the day to end, then dreaded the thought of another one beginning. By day 7, a dull, pervasive ache had replaced the sharp, acute pain like a constant companion he couldn't shake. His hands, once smooth, were rough, starting to crack in places, the skin thickened and calloused. It was still slower than the others, but his movements were less jerky, less confused. He'd learned the specific weight of each box, the right way to grip a bolt, the precise angle to place a component so it nested perfectly. But the mental fatigue was a new beast. The sheer monotony of it all, the endless repetition, threatened to crack his resolve. His mind, once buzzing with spreadsheets and market projections, now felt like a dull, worn-out gear, grinding through the same motions over and over. One afternoon, he fumbled a stack of freshly milled gears, sending them clattering to the concrete floor. The sound was loud, jarring, cutting through the factory din. A few heads turned. His supervisor, a lean man named Frank with eyes that missed nothing, walked over slowly. Glenn's face burned. He bent down quickly, scrambling to retrieve the scattered pieces. "Careful there, Glenn," Frank said, his voice flat, not unkind, but devoid of warmth. "These ain't cheap." "Can't afford to waste them." Glenn just nodded, unable to meet his gaze. It wasn't an explosion, not a dressing down, just a quiet, pointed reminder of his inadequacy, of the cost of his mistakes. It felt worse than a shout. He stood up, clutching the gears, his pride a raw, exposed nerve. The urge to just walk out, to disappear, to vanish back into the comfortable oblivion of his apartment was almost overwhelming. What was he doing? He was a liability, a drain, a clumsy amateur. He closed his eyes for a split second, taking a deep, ragged breath. Then he looked at the gears in his hand, perfectly machined, glinting under the fluorescent lights. He thought of Emily's smile, David's infectious laugh, Sarah's unwavering faith. He couldn't quit. Not now, not ever. He had to learn. He had to be better. Day 14 felt like he'd run a marathon every single morning before the alarm even sounded. He was perpetually tired, but there was a stubbornness settling into his bones. His mind wandered less, focusing on the immediate task. He wasn't efficient, not by factory standards, but he was reliable. He showed up on time every single day. He stayed till the whistle blew. He asked questions, quiet ones, usually directed at a grizzled veteran named Ray who'd been on the line longer than Glenn had been alive. Ray, initially gruff, had started offering small, unsolicited tips. "Don't lift with your back, son, use your legs." Or, "Keep your knuckles clear, that machine bites." These small gestures, almost imperceptible to an outsider, meant everything to Glenn. They were tiny breadcrumbs of acceptance, of being seen not just as the new, clumsy guy, but as a man trying to do an honest day's work. The shame hadn't vanished entirely, but it had shrunk, tucked away in a corner of his mind, replaced by a fierce, quiet determination. He was still battling the exhaustion, the muscle memory that just wasn't there yet, the constant drone of the machinery, but he was fighting. And he wasn't losing. Not yet. He realized the fight wasn't just against the physical demands. It was against the voice in his head telling him he wasn't good enough, against the easy path that no longer existed, against the man he used to be. Every stack, every bolt, every ache was a small victory against that voice. The "not yet" part felt like a prophecy waiting to be tested. The third week on the factory floor was a brutal, relentless grind. His muscles screamed a different tune every morning. Sometimes his shoulders burned. Sometimes his lower back ached with a deep, persistent throb that no hot shower could entirely soothe. The rhythmic clang and hiss of the machinery had burrowed deep into his skull, a constant, dull headache he carried even when he wasn't there. He'd catch himself zoning out, his gaze fixed on a conveyor belt, mind adrift, only to be jolted back by Ray's gruff, "You with us, son?" Or the sharp snap of the foreman's voice echoing down the line. One Tuesday, the schedule was tighter than a drum. A critical machine malfunctioned on the morning shift, backing up the entire production line. By the time Glenn's afternoon shift started, the pressure was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket of urgency. Orders needed to go out, and every hand was needed to make up for lost time. He was tasked with loading heavy metal components onto pallets, a job usually shared, but today everyone was stretched thin. Each component felt heavier than the last, the sharp edges digging into his gloved hands, the cold metal radiating through the fabric. Sweat beaded on his brow, trickling down into his eyes, blurring his vision. His breath came in ragged gasps. He missed a grab, the component slipping from his grasp with a sickening clang, narrowly missing his foot before landing heavily on the concrete floor. It wasn't damaged, but the noise drew every eye. The foreman, a man named Miller with a permanent scowl etched into his face, was on him in an instant. "What do you think this is, a tea party, Glenn? Pick it up. We don't have all day." Miller's voice, usually just loud, now carried an edge of genuine irritation. Glenn felt a hot flush creep up his neck. His hands trembled as he bent, the effort of lifting the heavy piece feeling monumental. A wave of exhaustion washed over him, a profound weariness that went deeper than muscle ache. It was a mental fatigue, a screaming urge to just stop, to walk out, to find a quiet corner and just collapse. He thought of his old life, the plush office chair, the air-conditioned boardrooms, the ease with which he delegated tasks like this. The sheer absurdity of his current situation compared to what he once had felt like a cruel cosmic joke. "What are you doing here?" The voice in his head sneered. "This isn't you. You're better than this. You're a failure." He almost dropped the next component. His grip was failing, his arms felt like lead. His vision started to tunnel. He pictured Sarah's face, worried and tired, trying to balance the checkbook late at night. He pictured Emily's quiet sadness when she couldn't get the new textbook for school, and David's resigned shrug when he heard, "No," for the latest video game. They needed him. This job, this brutal, unglamorous, back-breaking job, was what kept them afloat. Just as the metal started to slip, a hand, calloused and strong, covered his own, steadying it. Ray was beside him, not looking at him, but at the component. "Spread your feet wider, son. Use your hips. Don't fight the weight, flow with it." Ray's voice was low, devoid of judgment, just practical advice. He didn't offer to help with the lift, but the steadying hand, the presence, was enough. It was a lifeline. Glenn adjusted his stance, took a deeper breath, and pushed the weight onto the pallet. He didn't look at Ray, just nodded almost imperceptibly. Ray gave a small grunt and moved off to his own station, leaving Glenn to battle his inner demons and the physical demands. The rest of the shift was a blur of sweat and grit. He pushed through it, one component, one stack, one pallet at a time. Each successful lift felt like a tiny defiance against the voice telling him to quit, a small, hard-won victory against the overwhelming desire to just give up. Later that night, the house was dark, everyone asleep. Glenn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the aches in his body a symphony of protest. His mind, usually a whirl of worries, was strangely quiet. He could still hear the clang of the dropped component, Miller's sharp words. He could still feel the exhaustion, the shame. But something else was there now too. The warmth of Ray's hand, the quiet strength in his voice. And the image of Sarah's tired smile, Emily's quick hug, David's innocent question about his day. He hadn't quit. He had failed momentarily, but he hadn't quit. And tomorrow he'd go back. He closed his eyes, the decision made, a quiet, stubborn resolve settling deeper into his bones. The next morning was no easier. Every muscle protested, every fiber of his being screamed for the soft embrace of a mattress and the oblivion of sleep. But the quiet resolve from the night before held. He dragged himself out of bed before the first hint of dawn, the same grind, the same struggle, just with a little less internal argument. Days bled into weeks. The clang of the machines, the rhythmic thud of components, the whistle of the compressed air, it all started to coalesce not into a cacophony, but a strange, industrial symphony. His hands, once soft and unaccustomed, calloused and thickened. The ache in his shoulders became less a searing protest and more a dull, familiar companion. He learned the specific weight of each box, the balance point of every component. His movements, at first hesitant and wasted, grew efficient, almost economical. Stopped fighting the line and started flowing with it, anticipating the next tray, the next part. One Tuesday, about 3 weeks into the routine, he was struggling with a particularly stubborn pallet of heavy castings. Ray, working a few stations down, watched him for a minute, then ambled over. He didn't say a word, just reached out and silently nudged a loose wheel on Glenn's pallet jack with his foot, then gave a firm two-fingered tap on Glenn's elbow, indicating he should try again. Glenn, without a word, adjusted his grip, pulled harder, and this time the pallet rolled free. He looked up. and Ray offered a ghost of a smile, a rare upturn of the lips before turning back to his own work. It wasn't praise, not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, a quiet nod of approval from a man whose respect was earned, not given. A few days later, Glenn found himself explaining to a new hire how to brace a box correctly before lifting, using the same, "Use your hips." Advice Ray had given him. He heard the echoes of Ray's voice in his own. The new guy, young and fresh-faced, with the same bewildered exhaustion Glenn remembered so well, actually listened. And when the kid got it right, a small, genuine satisfaction bloomed in Glenn's chest. It was a faint spark, but it was there, pushing back against the old shadows. At home, Sarah noticed it first. "You're whistling?" she'd asked one evening, surprised, as he rinsed dishes after dinner. He hadn't even realized he was doing it, a tuneless hum, something almost cheerful. The incessant worry hadn't vanished entirely, not with bills still piling up and the kids' needs growing. But the crushing weight, the constant gnawing despair had lightened. He still talked little about work, but when Emily asked about his day, he didn't just grunt. He'd tell her about a particularly tricky part he'd managed to fix or a joke Miller had made. Not much, but enough for his daughter to see a flicker of something new in his eyes. Months passed. Glenn was no longer the clumsy, overwhelmed new guy. He was a fixture on the floor, dependable, quiet, but steady as an old oak. He knew the rhythms of the factory, the personalities of the crew. He was the one who could troubleshoot a jammed machine with a practiced hand, who could heft the heaviest loads without complaint. His calloused hands moved with a quiet competence that spoke volumes. The old arrogance, the entitlement, it had been scoured clean by sweat and toil. What remained was a man who understood the fundamental truth of earning your keep. He found himself looking at the worn machinery, the grimy floors, the perpetually oil-stained hands of his colleagues, not with disdain, but with a deep, unexpected sense of belonging. This was his world now, and in it he had found something he'd never had before. Respect earned honestly by showing up every day, by doing the work, by pulling his weight. When a younger worker, struggling with a heavy component, dropped it with a clang, Glenn didn't yell or even sigh impatiently. He simply walked over, picked it up with a practiced grip, and silently showed the kid the right way to lift it, his movements economical, his eyes kind. The kid nodded, grateful. It was a tiny moment, but it was everything. Small house, once a stark reminder of what he'd lost, now felt like a refuge, a stronghold built by his own hands, his own effort. He'd fixed a leaky faucet last month, replaced a broken fence post in the garden. Small victories, yes, but each one filled him with a quiet satisfaction that 100 inherited riches never had. He'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching Emily and David kick a ball around the small front yard, Sarah tending to her little patch of petunias. He'd feel the slight ache in his body from a hard day's work, but it was an honest ache, a good ache. He was providing. He was present. He was a man who knew what it meant to earn, to build, to protect. And in that, he realized, lay a wealth far more enduring than any fortune he'd squandered. He'd often find himself watching Sarah and the kids, their everyday lives unfolding around him like a quiet symphony. Emily helping David with homework, Sarah humming softly as she cooked dinner. A pang of memory might surface. A sprawling mansion, a fleet of luxury cars, a yacht cutting through azure waters, but it was a faint echo, quickly overshadowed. He used to chase those things, believing they were the sum total of success, the very definition of wealth. But they were just gilded cages, full of empty rooms and lonelier nights. Turns out it ain't. Real wealth, he learned, wasn't measured in digits in a bank account, but in the warmth of a hand in his, the genuine laughter of his children, the quiet knowing glance shared with his wife. It was waking up each morning, knowing he earned his keep, knowing he was needed, loved, and respected not for what he had, but for who he was and what he did. And so it was with Glenn, a man who once had everything, only to lose it all and find something far more precious. He carried the quiet resolve of a factory worker, yes, but also the deep peace of a man who'd finally struck gold. A fortune built not with money, but with sweat and love. A kind of wealth no market crash, no greedy uncle, no twist of fate could ever touch. He felt it most keenly on evenings like this. The sun dipping below the row of houses, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The smell of Sarah's cooking drifting from the open kitchen window. Tonight, it was her shepherd's pie, a comfort smell that wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Emily's slightly off-key singing from her room, David's distant shouts as he chased a stray ball down the street. These were the threads of his new fortune, woven tightly, intricately into the fabric of his everyday. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the gentle breeze wash over his face, feeling the faint tremor in his hands, not from fear, but from the rhythm of the punch press he'd operated all day. It was a familiar tremor, a badge of honest labor. He remembered a time when his hands had been soft, manicured, only used for signing checks or gripping a crystal glass. Those hands had held no real power, no true purpose, only the illusion of control granted by inherited money. Now they were calloused, strong, capable. They built, they repaired, they provided. A soft voice broke his reverie. "Penny for your thoughts, old man." Sarah stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, a soft smile playing on her lips. Her hair, tied back loosely, had a few stray wisps escaping, framing a face that was more beautiful to him now than any supermodel he'd once seen gracing the covers of magazines in his former life. Her eyes, tired from a day of teaching and then coming home to wrangle 2 kids and dinner, held a warmth, a steady light that grounded him. He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Just counting my blessings, Sarah." She came and sat beside him on the porch swing, the aged wood creaking a gentle protest under their combined weight. She leaned her head on his shoulder, a comfortable silence settling between them, a silence born of years of shared struggles and triumphs. He felt the light weight of her head, the soft warmth of her body against his, and a profound sense of peace settled deep within him. This was it. This was everything. But even in this contentment, a flicker of his old self, his old anxieties, sometimes pricked at him. Was he doing enough? Was this simple life enough for them? He knew it was enough for him, more than enough. But Sarah, she'd stuck by him through the ruin, through the humiliating fall from grace. She'd never once complained, never once looked at him with anything but love and unwavering support. Did she ever miss the grand parties, the effortless travel, the life of ease? He knew she wouldn't admit it if she did, not to him. She was too loyal, too kind. And that loyalty, that kindness, sometimes amplified his lingering sense of inadequacy, that old whisper that he wasn't quite good enough, that he hadn't quite earned her. He tightened his arm around her, a protective gesture, a reassurance to himself as much as to her. "The pie smells great," he murmured, changing the subject from the unspoken worries. "It'll be ready in 20, she replied, her voice soft against his ear. "Emily's almost done with her math and David's just about worn himself out." Just on cue, David burst around the corner of the house, hair disheveled, face flushed, the soccer ball tucked under his arm. "Dad, Mom. Guess what? I almost scored. Mrs. Henderson's cat thought it was a mouse." Glenn laughed, a genuine, unforced sound that felt good to his throat, to his soul. "Did you now, champ? Sounds like you gave that cat a good scare." David puffed out his chest, beaming. "Yeah, and then Emily came out and said I was being too loud, but I wasn't." Emily appeared moments later, a book tucked under her arm, looking far too grown-up for her 14 years. He was Dad. Mrs. Henderson was trying to read. She gave David an exasperated look, but there was an underlying affection in it. This was the rhythm of their evenings. The small squabbles, the shared jokes, the mundane reports from their day. These were the moments he'd once been too busy, too preoccupied with important business meetings and lavish social engagements to truly notice. He'd delegated parental duties, seen his children as extensions of his status, little trophies to be admired from a distance. Now, he wouldn't trade these chaotic, loving moments for all the corner office views in the world. He remembered a particularly opulent Christmas party from his past, years ago, at their sprawling estate. He'd been surrounded by dozens of friends and business associates, the air thick with the clinking of crystal and the murmur of polite conversation. He'd smiled, nodded, made all the right moves, but inside he'd felt a profound emptiness, a chilling isolation. His kids had been with a nanny tucked away in their wing, only brought down for a brief staged appearance. Sarah had been a beautiful accessory on his arm, her eyes sparkling, but a hint of something unfulfilled always lingered there, a quiet sadness he'd been too blind, too self-absorbed to truly see or address. Now Christmas meant stringing popcorn on thread with David, untangling fairy lights with Emily, and Sarah singing off-key carols as she baked gingerbread. It meant the smell of pine needles, the warmth of the fireplace, and the chaos of wrapping paper exploding in the living room. It meant laughter, genuine, hearty laughter, not the forced chuckles of social etiquette. That was the real wealth. The kind that warmed you from the inside out, not just made you look good on the outside. David, having recounted his near goal with Mrs. Henderson's cat, finally ran out of breath. He looked up at Glenn, his brow furrowed. "Dad, can we go to the park tomorrow? There's a new kid who can kick really far." Glenn paused. Tomorrow was Saturday. He had planned to tackle the loose shingles on the roof, a repair he could handle himself, saving them the cost of a roofer. But David's hopeful eyes, the simple desire for connection, for his father's presence. "Sure, champ." Glenn said, a smile spreading across his face. "We can hit the park. Maybe I'll even teach you a new trick or two." David's face lit up, a pure, unadulterated joy that melted away any lingering thoughts of roof repairs. "Really? Awesome!" He bounced on the balls of his feet. Sarah squeezed Glenn's arm. "You're a good dad, Glenn." Her voice was quiet, but it resonated with a depth of feeling that made his chest ache in the best possible way. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw the appreciation, the respect in her eyes. Not the admiration for his former status, but for the man he had become. This quiet acknowledgement from her meant more than all the applause and accolades of his past life combined. He felt a blush creep up his neck, still uncomfortable with direct praise, a leftover from his days of entitlement where praise was expected, not earned. But this